The US is heading into an election year, and let's be real, it's quite a circus. And this is when you typically hear a lot of Americans yelling about moving to Canada. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the statistics, it looks like Americans are way more interested in Mexico than Canada. And we're going to be talking about why in today's podcast and video. Hi, and welcome back to Entrepreneur Expat. I'm Amanda, and this is.
I'm Justin.
And we are entrepreneurs and expats currently living in Mexico. And what we bring to you on this podcast and channel is topics that interest expats. And we are on a mission to connect 1 million expat entrepreneurs and aspiring expats all across the world. So if that's something that you're interested in, make sure to join our community by subscribing and liking this video. So without further ado, let's get into these statistics that came out in 2022 that more Americans are interested in Mexico than Canada. You want to say what some of these
Absolutely.
statistics are?
So, according to a study by Hire a Helper, which is a moving company, Mexico is actually the top destination for Americans moving abroad. And in 2022, 75% more Americans moved to Mexico than they did to Canada. Uh, why is it that so many of our friends and colleagues are seeking essentially refuge in Mexico and choosing Mexico over Canada when coming from the US?
Well, it's actually really interesting because ever since I came here to Mexico, so many of our friends and colleagues are more interested in Latin America. They're also super interested in Portugal, but that's a video for another time. Mostly they're just interested in not being so much in the West anymore, which I find very fascinating. Just yesterday, just in the last week, I've actually spoken with quite a few Canadians that I was getting to know for our other business and our other podcast, Make Money Your Honey. Many had dual citizenship between the United States and Canada. And one of the things that they noted, and what one in particular was telling me that he's trying to convince his wife to actually leave Canada. And he also doesn't want to go back to the United States. So this is new because Canada, I guess, always seemed like I think Russell Brand talked about this on a video recently. Canada always seemed like I guess, to the world or to Americans, the less imperialistic, less brutal, less greedy,
More polite.
more
Yeah.
polite version of like the United States or the UK. Like it still had those elements, but it just wasn't as bad. So people were like, I'm going to Canada. And now people are like, F that, I'm going to Mexico. So let's talk about why. Just based on this is completely anecdotal. This is based on what we're hearing just from friends, colleagues, concerns that have been coming up for people, and also what we've been hearing from expats here in Mexico. And one thing that I want to say before we start going into each of these is that this doesn't really have anything to do with politics. It does, but it doesn't. Because it doesn't matter whether you're super conservative or super liberal. It seems that people are coming to the same conclusion, which is something is not right and it's probably time for a plan B.
What we've noticed talking to a lot of friends that are from Canada who have moved to Mexico, who have moved to other places in Latin America, is that unfortunately a lot of the situation in Canada is very reminiscent of what's happening in the US, if not worse, with, in many cases, authoritarianism, laws being created that are very controlling of the populace, certain leaders in Canada, in fact, praising countries like China for things like their social credit score, which is essentially just a way of tracking the masses and giving them access to certain things or taking away access from certain things based on uh, whether or not they agree with the government, based on little things that they do, based on their presence on social media. And it's becoming apparent that the situation in Canada, instead of becoming more and more free and going in the direction that Americans historically have known Canadians as being, like these kind of, more perhaps free,
Progressive, maybe.
progressive,
Yeah.
even in some cases libertarian, not really messing with the rights of others. In fact, now it seems like the exact opposite is happening up there in Canada. So it's no longer a very appealing destination for Americans to go to, what else do you have to say about that?
Well, along those lines, I think a lot of people started realizing these things during the pandemic, during COVID. Mexico handled the pandemic completely differently than Canada did, which led to a boom here in Mexico. I heard, Mexico oftentimes gets referred to as a second tier country, is what they call it. But what's happening now is because of exactly what you just said, certain laws being passed, and we'll get into some specific ones momentarily, or just like the circus that the political systems have turned into.
We're shutting down the government. No, we're not. We're shutting it down. No, we're not. We're shutting it down. We need to find. We're gonna filibuster.
Yeah, I mean,
It sounds more like an episode of Monty Python than an actual live stream of C-SPAN.
Um, so
Yeah.
because of those things, Mexico really stood out in the world as a place where there was more freedom and more liberties during the pandemic because Mexico stayed open, which is why you're seeing, at least in terms of American numbers, but I'm sure Canadians are similar. But I think you saw almost like a double since 2019 in the amount of Americans asking for residency or visas in Mexico, and that's
I
not
think it
even,
was more than that. I think it
and
was almost three times.
well, that's not including tourist visas. If we
Right, just
include
just the actual
just the
residency
actual
applications.
residency
Yeah, you're
application,
right. It was almost double. It was like 18,000 in
19,
2019, yeah, to over 38,000.
no, it was like 30,000, I
Yeah,
think.
it
Yeah,
was
but
it was
again,
like 30.
the 30,000 is not not including tourist visas. If we,
People that just stay here without having
yeah,
to pay
if we
paper.
included tourist visas, it's probably another tens of thousands, honestly, if I were to guess. So Mexico handled COVID completely differently than, for example, Canada did. I remember having a trainer, a personal trainer. It was virtual. She was in Canada. She was out of Toronto. And we're like 18 months into this COVID thing, and they're like completely still shut down. Meanwhile, Mexico was wide open 3 weeks after the
Beaches were
COVID started.
open. There was never a restriction on people coming in or out of the country. It was a much different.
Even now, we're here in Mexico, and we were hearing that in certain parts of the US they were starting with the pandemic stuff again, and in Mexico they just laugh. They're like, oh, there they go again. Um, so Mexico just handled that completely differently, and in a weird way, Mexico kind of became like a beacon of hope for liberty in the world when it came to COVID, which helped a lot of Americans want to move here even more. So if you compare, Mexico being completely open during COVID to Canada, which was the exact opposite, it was pretty brutal in Canada, then, Americans are probably going for Mexico.
Yeah, and there's a lot more happening behind the scenes too that a lot of people aren't talking about. And in fact, uh, to make things worse, like Canada has actually enacted laws, or they're
In the
about to,
process,
they're in the
yeah.
process of enacting laws that specifically are designed to censor essentially political opponents. So if you're trying to say something on social media platforms that the government doesn't agree with you on, they have the right to basically go and say, "Hey YouTube, hey Facebook, please take this video down. It does not conform to the laws that we've passed around forget exactly what they call it, but like online publishing laws that they have. And sure, is there some benefit to the government maybe sponsoring certain types of content? Maybe, like you could argue for that. But when you start to put government control over social media platforms and basically saying, here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed, we're going to give you these big fines if you allow any of this kind of content to be published, what you're doing is getting down this very, very, very slippery slope. The other thing that, in my opinion, much, much, much crosses the line already of that authoritarian control is that in the cases of, for example, the trucker convoys, in the cases of other like political protests and things like that that did not agree with the ruling party at the time, they actually were able to just say, you know what, bank, just go ahead and shut down this person's account. The police could literally sign an order that without any kind of trial, without any kind of due process, immediately somebody's bank account is just frozen. They can't access their money, they can't send transfers, they can't use their debit card. and people are just tired of it. People are sick of it.
Well,
Their
it's red
common sense.
flags. It's red
Yeah,
flags. Yeah. So, like, we were at a birthday party last night. We were the only Americans, and Mexicans are like in shock. They're like, wait a minute, we're all trying to go to the US and Canada, and y'all are trying to come down here. What's going on? So, we started explaining some of these things, and they hear some of the laws that are passing in Canada, for example, and they're like, wait, what?
yeah, that sounds like some
That sounds
communist
like
shit
some
if there ever
crazy
was
nuclear
any.
thing we deal with in Latin America. What are you talking about, right? So they're
Yeah.
like in shock when they hear these things. Or California came up, right? They're like, wait, what's that state where like people can steal up to like $1,000 worth of stuff
And
and
you
nobody
can't
does
stop
anything?
them. You would go to jail for trying to prevent a
Y'all, the
shoplifter.
Mexicans are in shock over stuff going on in the United
Yeah.
States and Canada when we start telling them, like they can't even believe it because they hear these things and they're like, wait a minute, that's like the stuff we deal with like dictators and authoritarian governments in Latin America, and now you guys are dealing with that in Canada and the United States. So all of that to say, from what we're hearing, is that a lot of Americans, right, are feeling uneasy about laws and corruption and things like that in the United States. And then they look over to Canada, which used to be an option for them, and they're realizing Canada's not really an option anymore because they see some of the laws that Canada is now trying to pass, like debanking people. Which, me personally, I don't care what your opinion is, that doesn't give the government the right to shut down your bank account.
Basic services, access
That's
to
crossing the
basic
line.
things. Now, you mentioned something earlier, Amanda, about how a lot of people from different Latin American countries come to the U.S. And when we had a discussion about this a few days ago, you mentioned this whole idea of like Maslow's hierarchy and
Yeah.
people coming from a certain country for like opportunity to work, but then Americans realizing, okay, great, we have the basic needs covered, but some of our freedoms are being taken away. Between the US and Canada
They're
and
making it
or
harder for me to do business.
exactly,
Yeah.
business is becoming more complicated. Touch on that a little bit if you will,
Yeah.
around that
So
hierarchy and how people are seeking the next best thing in terms of where to live.
first of all, human beings have always looked for the next best thing in terms of where to live since the beginning of time. I mean, we were nomadic. I don't even know how long human beings were nomadic, but I would argue that we're still somewhat nomadic. It's only in the 20th century that we started hearing the story about the United States being the best country in the world. I got that story. My parents fled communism from Cuba. I'm sure you got that story
Hmm.
to a degree from both your sides, the
Yeah.
American side and then also the Ukrainian, Russian fleeing Soviet Union side. We
Hmm.
got that story. We get it. And we understand it to a degree. There's definite pros to being in the United States. So, if you're coming from situations like our families did, then the United States looks like a really good deal. Although, arguably, even our families who, for example, fled communism are starting to see major red flags in the United States and Canada and Western Europe that has them totally freaked out because they're like, whoa, whoa, we've been through this before. This is not looking good.
Yeah.
Arguably. Um, but if you are coming from a situation where, I don't know, you're born in a country where perhaps there's not that much opportunity, being Mexican, being born in Mexico is a different experience than being an American expat in Mexico. I know one country a lot of Americans have their eye on right now, and one city is Buenos Aires. Argentina is a disaster for Argentines, but it's looking very attractive to Americans with money. So an Argentine might be like, I'm going to Mexico or I'm going to the United States for better opportunity. Whereas the American is like, F that, I'm trying to build a business, I'm trying to build wealth. They're making it more difficult. I'm going to Buenos Aires. So
It's just so funny to
it's
observe the
hilarious.
movement of people, and then the Mexicans saying, "Why are you guys coming here? We're all going there." And my mom said the same thing. She said, she's got this Eastern European accent. She's like, "Justin, I don't understand. I came here when I was 16 because we left Soviet Russia. We come here. We find lots of opportunity, and you are going and you are in Mexico and Colombia, and I don't understand. What are you doing?" And that's what my mom always says, right? She doesn't get it because just like your parents, she came from a former communist, arguably still communist regime, and came to America and saw the other side of that coin. But now as Americans, we're seeing, okay, compared to what we were raised with, compared to how we grew up,
This
this is
is not
very
the
different. It's
right.
not the same
It's not the
America.
United States my parents got to in the 60s and the 70s. No way. Absolutely not. Just like this isn't the Mexico of the 80s.
And it's perspective.
Yes.
It's both. It's perspective and it's history evolving over time, and us realizing that, well, not evolving, but it's history playing itself out. It's things might be different, and the narrative is one thing in the 60s and the 70s. Then obviously the economy changes, the policies change, the government changes, and then relatively speaking, Mexico's developing and developing and developing and growing, and a lot of the countries in the West are either staying the same or arguably
Getting worse.
declining.
Declining,
And
arguably.
so
Yeah.
when you look at that balance now, coming to Latin America doesn't seem like such a bad play, especially considering Canada for a lot of Americans is more of the same. In fact, in many cases, even stricter, even more authoritarian, even more trying to control the populace.
Yeah, so those are some of the reasons why Americans are finding Mexico very attractive. Of course, there's also stuff like cost of living. Mexico is obviously a lot less expensive than Canada. So that obviously probably has something to do with it as well. But more than anything, what we're hearing is that people are just feeling very uneasy about a lot of the laws that are passing in Canada. And again, this isn't like you could be a conservative or a liberal, and everybody's spidey senses are kind of starting to go off like something's not right. Like they're starting to cross some lines, something's not right. So the spidey senses are starting to go off for people who have means. And, it's actually really interesting because I was having this conversation with someone here in Mexico, and he was like, "What is going on? That all you like you could shake a palm tree and Americans fall out in Mexico." And I was explaining to him some of these concerns that a lot of Americans are feeling and experiencing, and he was like, "That's nuts. Like that's usually the stuff that we have to worry about. What do you mean you guys
Hmm.
are worrying about that over there?" And then they're like, "Well," and then, to those people who are like, they're like, "Oh, the United States is the best country in the world." That's just like the PR that we've gotten. That's it. And I think for a time, 50, 60 years ago, maybe that was the case. Maybe the United States was one of the best countries in the world, but it's not the same United States that it was 50, 60 years ago. Just like all these other countries that are emerging are not the same countries that they were 50, 60 years ago.
And it's
Things
important to
change.
change that narrative. It's
Yeah.
important to really do your own research, do research for yourself. Come down here. Come visit us in Mexico. Go to Colombia, go to Brazil, check out other parts of the world and really see for yourself. You'll realize that it's not the same as what the mainstream media is telling you. It's not the same as what perhaps your parents or your grandparents are saying based on their experience decades ago.
And the irony of that is, Americans have a tendency of, I had this conversation with someone yesterday. They're like, well, Americans have like percentage wise has like some of the fewest passport holders out of countries, which is insane considering how many countries Americans can go to with just automatic visa, just with the
Hmm.
blue passport. And a lot of American, which is one of the benefits of it. And a lot of Americans don't realize that. And I think a lot of Americans just there's no culture in the United States of like looking outside of the United States or looking outside of the West typically,
Yeah.
but it looks like because people are feeling uneasy about what they saw during the pandemic, because they're feeling uneasy about laws that are passing, because they're like, this is an effing circus with our politicians.
Mhm.
Now it seems like people are opening their eyes a little bit more, or at least they're more open to the idea of living outside of the West, which I would consider Mexico to be outside of the West. It definitely has Western influences, but this is not the West.
Ideologically, it's
Yeah,
much different,
it's
and
much different.
culturally,
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
So that's what we're hearing. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you are American, do you prefer Canada or Mexico?
And why?
And why? Yeah, we would love to hear because again, it depends on the person, right? Like it's that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For, someone in Latin America, it might make more sense. Born in Latin America, it might make more sense to go to Canada. But if you were born in Canada, for example, it might make more sense for you to leave with the stuff going on, in which case we're all just doing the same thing that humans have done since the beginning of time, which is just go where there's better opportunity for you.
And that's the benefit of being an entrepreneur expat. You can actually make those choices freely based on what actually makes sense for you, not based on what a job requires or having to be somewhere in person or having to be obligated for whatever reason to stay in a place that might not value you as much or that might not be the best fit for you. It's about actually creating that freedom in your life through business, through entrepreneurship, through becoming an entrepreneur expat. It's about creating that freedom so that you really can choose where you actually want to live, where you want to plant your roots, where you want to build and grow. And that may not necessarily be the place that you were born.
All right, guys, so that's what we got for today. If you liked this, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Make sure to leave us a comment, share it with a friend. We might be shouting you guys out in future videos and future podcast episodes. You can also check out all our programs that we have available, our waitlist, our free resources, free guides. We got so many goodies for you guys. You can find them all in the description and in the show notes. And, we'll catch you guys on the next one. If there's anything that you guys want us to cover on this channel, let us know. And we're going to make a promise to you guys. Number one, to build a community of global expats. And number two, to cover as many of these topics that you guys find to be important as you are making your decisions as possible.
Bye for now. See you on the next episode.